Thank you for coming. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming. I'm Zan Dubin. This webinar grew out of our grassroots campaign, Dodger Fans Against Fossil Fuels, which urges owners of the Los Angeles Dodgers to end their sponsorship deal with oil giant Phillips 66. Phillips owns the 76 gas station chain, whose logos you see all over Dodger Stadium. We have called this greenwashing or sportswashing, which seeks to make Dodger fans see deadly fossil fuels the same way they see and feel about their beloved baseball team. As our panelist Bill McKibben has said, this branding builds the idea with every game that fossil fuels are, quote, necessary, a normal part of the world around us, instead of what they really are, the most dangerous thing on earth, unquote. A bit of housekeeping, this webinar will be recorded and sent to registrants. We plan to have about 10 minutes of Q&A at the end. I want to thank Sierra Club Angeles chapter, the host and sponsor of our Dodgers campaign and this webinar, and our three remarkable speakers. Thank you. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator. Sammy Roth is the LA Times climate columnist. He writes the twice-weekly Boiling Point newsletter and hosts the Boiling Point podcast, both of which focus on clean energy solutions. He previously reported for the Desert Sun and USA Today, where he covered renewable energy and public lands. Sammy grew up in Westwood and would very much like to see the Dodgers win the World Series again. Sammy, take it away, please.
Hey, Zan. No, thanks very much to you and to the Sierra Club Angeles chapter for organizing this this panel and asking me to moderate. And yeah, that line about me wanting to see the Dodgers win the World Series again comes directly from my LA Times biography page. After they won in 2020, I asked the staff director to just add the word "again" on there. That was the only update needed. We've got three great panelists here, and I'm guessing for everyone who is attending, probably you're familiar with a couple of them already. So I'll try to keep the intros brief here. Bill McKibben, one of the preeminent environmental activists and writers, has been doing this for a real long time. You've probably read a lot of his work. The book "The End of Nature." I co-founded 350.org. Now he works with the group Third Act, which he founded as well. He and I have been interviewed him several times about this issue, sports washing, and definitely eager to hear what he has to say tonight. Naomi Oreskes, science historian, Harvard University, wrote the book Merchants of Doubt, which is really the history that you need to read if you haven't already about major industry, including big tobacco and the fossil fuel industry, obscuring the truth about how their products are harmful for the environment and for public health, other industries as well, but just sort of the text on industry tactics for trying to hide what their products are sort of doing to human health and the environment. And so she'll be talking about that aspect of the sports washing story. And then Representative Christopher Rabb from Pennsylvania, he and I met for the first time a couple of days ago prepping for this panel, and he's got a really interesting bill right now, which he'll tell us about and how that relates to this conversation, a first of its kind bill. And he, by the way, I should say, represents what he described to me as the bluest district in Pennsylvania, in the House of Representatives there, in northwestern Philadelphia. And he's got a really interesting bill that would, not quite as I understand it, outlaw greenwashing in Pennsylvania, but would make it possible for representatives of that state to bring lawsuits against companies that are engaging in false claims of environmentalism and environmental stewardship, which is definitely related to what we're talking about here. So I'm going to ask some questions of the panelists, and like Zan said, we'll have time for audience questions at the end. At least 10 minutes. I'll try to leave some more time than that, because I imagine folks are going to want to ask questions. Bill, let me start with you here. And actually I'll give a little brief context for this. I mean, I started writing about sports and climate change just because, as I mentioned, I'm a big Dodgers fan, and it sort of just started getting under my skin that at Dodger Stadium there are these really big 76 gasoline advertisements, as Zan mentioned, above both scoreboards, and they've been there for a real long time. Dodger Stadium was actually built in part in the 1960s with oil money. It was Union Oil, which was the original owner of that 76 gas brand, that helped finance construction of the stadium more than 60 years ago. And this has been sort of the major advertiser ever since. And so I just started to wonder, why do oil companies spend all this money advertising at Dodger Stadium and I mean, just the more I started paying attention, the more I realized that basically anywhere that I went to see a baseball game or watched a sporting event on TV, you'd see Chevron or Arco or Marathon Petroleum or Energy Transfer, some major oil or gas company. So it just started to, get the climate reporter gears churning in my brain of what's going on here. So my question, Bill, I guess, is why does this matter? Why is this something that for you as a climate activist and writer that you think folks should care about or that you care about?
Well, first of all, let me just say many, many thanks to you for raising this issue not once but repeatedly. Um, I do think it's important and I think it's ignored. And I think that you have managed, you're doing the thing that we need a lot more of, which is a kind of crusading journalism from time to time. And this is a good fight to be taken on. And since we're talking about competitions, I've been uh, telling everyone and writing that I think it's high time that someone handed you a Pulitzer for the work you've been doing out there on the coast, because it's been really profound and amazing.
I appreciate that. I should say journalism awards are overrated, but that's very kind of you.
This matters because sports matters. Um, um, you know, there, we when we write newspapers and we tend to think that politics is the only important thing in the world. But in fact, for most human beings who are pursuing most other things are more important in our lives. Our families, the work that we're doing. For some people, it's art or music. And for a lot of people, it's sports. It's one of the great sublime things that humans have figured out how to do to fill their time with, to give meaning to their lives. And advertisers long since figured out the importance of this. That's why they're willing to devote large resources to making it happen. In general, that's not such a bad thing. It underwrites the this thing that appeals to everybody. But it becomes a bad thing when the underlying thing that we're advertising is truly dangerous. The analogy here and the earlier campaign was against the tobacco companies that used sports to make people think it was okay and indeed desirable, sexy, whatever, to smoke cigarettes. And that was one of the places where campaigners really engaged the tobacco industry. We used to have the Winston Cup in the NASCAR and on and on and on. And we don't, because people got on it and said, this is not okay. Uh, Climate change and the role that fossil fuel plays in it is really very analogous in a very deep way. In the same way that not only does smoking cigarettes kill you, smoking cigarettes also impairs your ability to go do sports. So the rapid rise in the planet's temperature not only causes flooding and fires and all the other things that sadly we know a lot about, it also directly interferes with our ability to go do this wonderful, sublime thing that we call sports. My particular sport is Nordic skiing. That's the thing that I care about. And the World Championships started today in Trondheim, Norway, in the center of Scandinavia, and they're skiing on slush because the temperature has been 40 degrees day after day after day. The same with every other sport, which, it gets, we're running the marathon in the Olympics at 2 in the morning now because it's too hot to do it in the day. Uh, uh, you know, I grew up, I'll just end here this impassioned sermon by saying I grew up going to the bleachers in Fenway Park. Um, and we called them the bleachers because, you sat out in the sun and it was fun. And it also cost $1.50 when, back in the day. Um, now, not only does it not cost $1.50, there are a lot of days when bleachers is becoming a kind of literal I mean, it's no fun to sit out in 95 or 100-degree heat, which is what's happening time after time after time.
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously, as a baseball fan, that's why I identify with, and in Los Angeles, I've been experiencing that more and more of, I mean, I was at the World Series game in 2017 where the first pitch temperature, and this was in October at 5 p.m., it was either, I'm forgetting if it was 101 or 103, but it was one of them, and I mean, that was a record game start temperature at the time. And it's getting worse, but I think the biggest baseball climate impact thus far has been it was Hurricane. I'm forgetting now if it was Helene or Milton. I think it was Milton, but the
Nope.
Tampa Bay Rays, Milton, yeah, the Tampa Bay Rays Stadium in St. Petersburg, Florida, was designed to withstand very high strength hurricane winds, and nonetheless, the roof was torn off. Mostly, the stadium was just completely wrecked. The Rays aren't going to be able to play there in 2025. They don't really know when, if they're going to move back in. As far as I'm aware, that's got to be one of the biggest climate-related impacts to professional sports in the United States thus far.
Tammy, you're a young man. You may not recall that pretty much exactly the same thing happened in Hurricane Katrina when the roof of the Superdome was blown off or damaged in
Yeah,
2005. And
yeah,
this is the new world.
yeah. Naomi, let me bring you in here. I mean, the tactic that Bill, is describing and alluding to there, the term I've used is social license, that I've heard people use as social license to operate, which I know you've written about, that fossil fuel companies that taking out these advertisements like tobacco companies before them, they're it's subtle, but they're buying goodwill. They're attaching themselves to these, creating these positive associations with, with the Dodgers, with whoever it is, with these beloved institutions. Can you talk about sort of, I mean, one, does this work? What have you found? What does the research say about this? And two, if it works, how does it work? Why is this something that has the effect that it does?
Well, corporate America wants us to believe that they're benevolent, that they make goods and services that we need, that we love, that they create jobs, and that we can't live without them. And they do this in a lot of different ways. They spend money on marketing and advertising, they lobby politicians, but they also contribute to cultural and social activities, sports, museums, the ballet, um, almost anything you can think about, the aquarium, because they know that if people go and do something fun, something enjoyable, like go to a baseball game or go to an aquarium, and then they see the logo of the corporation associated with that, this creates a sense of goodwill that these corporations are good citizens supporting the community, supporting things we care about. And I don't want to say that all corporations are malevolent. I think this is something you have to look at a case by case basis. But we certainly know that some corporations produce products that do huge amounts of damage. And so what we often see is that those corporations are the ones who spend the most money on this kind of social licensing because they realize they have a problem. They're selling a product that is killing people, that is damaging property, that is making it hard to do things we care about, whether it's skiing or baseball or just taking a walk in the woods with our children. We've had wildfires so bad in parts of America now that it's not safe to go outside to just take a simple walk in the woods or in the park with your kids. So these companies are doing colossal damage. It's costing us money. It's raising the price of things we care about. I mean, I'm sure when that Tampa Bay stadium gets fixed, the cost is going to be passed on to the fans and it's become even more expensive. And by the way, Bill, did you really pay $1.50 to sit in the bleachers? It was 75 cents at Yankee Stadium. New
Oh
Yorkers are
gosh, we've got a
competitive
Yankees
about
fan here.
everything. Yeah. So the point is, these costs are being passed on to us, but the corporations are trying to distract us with this greenwashing, this sports washing, to say, look how great we are. We support the baseball team that you love.
Yeah. And I mean, is the tobacco industry a good comparison there? I mean, yeah, does this line up
Absolutely.
with what you've,
Yeah,
okay.
I think, yeah, what we're seeing here is practically identical. So one of the things we know that the tobacco industry did when word began to get out that tobacco smoking was as, colossally dangerous as it in fact was, the tobacco industry began to spend a lot of money on philanthropy. So while they're killing people, they're spending money to support museums, the ballet, and sports. And a particularly egregious thing they did was to support women's sports because much of the evidence of the harms of tobacco began to come out in the 60s and 70s at the very same time that women athletes were really pushing hard for more women's sports, some degree of equity. I mean, it still wasn't even remotely really equitable, but at least beginning to push for equity. And one particular area where that happened was in women's tennis, where the prize monies for women's tennis tournaments was way, way lower than the prize money in men's tournaments, even though lots of fans loved women's tennis and there were great athletes playing tennis. So the tobacco industry created the Virginia Slims tournament linked to the Virginia Slims cigarette, which was then heavily marketed to women. And some people in the audience will be old enough to remember the slogan, "You've come a long way, baby." So playing on feminist themes to try to persuade women that it was somehow liberating to smoke Virginia Slims cigarettes, when in fact those cigarettes were killing those women.
You know, I don't know the history of tennis particularly well, so a lot of this is new for me, but it's reminding me that one of the actually minority owners of the Dodgers right now is the famous women's tennis star Billie Jean King. She and her partner bought an ownership share of the Dodgers several years ago, and you know, the Dodgers ownership has just declined to respond to all of my requests for comments on the 76 advertisements. So there's a connection there.
Well, maybe we can recruit her to get involved with this cause. And of course, you could see how this becomes quite tricky, because I'm sure there were many women athletes who welcomed the industry's support of women's tennis. They made tournaments possible that wouldn't otherwise have happened. And that's the whole point. They buy goodwill by doing things that are genuinely good in order to distract us from the things they're doing that are genuinely bad.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I don't want to say I'm sympathetic to that necessarily, but as I've been doing some of this reporting, I've talked to people who have been, you know, involved historically in sustainability in the sports industry. And one of the responses I've gotten to this is, look, the most important thing is reducing emissions. And to the extent that they have these, you know, bad actor sponsors who are willing to give money, just look, take their money and use it to reduce emissions and to install solar panels, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't agree with that necessarily, but I do understand at least how someone could get to that mentality. But it is something that I've heard, and I think
Well,
that that's something.
we're all shaking our heads over that, because
Yeah,
one of the things I've learned over the years that I've studied these things is that the power of rationalization is very great.
yeah.
And in a way, this is why, greenwashing, whitewashing it's a kind of money laundering, right? They're taking this dirty money from a dirty industry, but then kind of money laundering it by saying, well, but we support all these good things. And then people get pulled into that, especially maybe you have a cause that you really believe in and you are underfunded. I mean, we see this at universities all the time. I mean, we're not here to talk about academia, we're here to talk about sports. But I mean, this is all over academia, that noxious industries give money to universities to show how great they are, and academics accept it because they say, but education is so important, and these monies help us do these things we care about. And so that's partly how it works, by bringing in otherwise good people who are trying to do good things, but they get co-opted. I mean, that really is the word for it.
Representative Rabb, you're nodding along vigorously and having some thoughts, I think.
I am. I agree with everything. And I just want to mention real quick, Bill mentioned the Pulitzer. A lot of people are familiar with the Nobel Prize for Peace. One of the reasons the Nobel Prize is so important in this discussion is it was a way for people to forget what he did in inventing dynamite. He wanted to change his legacy, which a lot of folks, wealthy individuals and corporations seek to do. So they pay for a new image. So there would be no Nobel Prize if it were not for the invention of dynamite and the wealth that came from it. So all of these things are interconnected. And if corporations did not feel the pressure from society at large about the need to embrace sustainability, they just wouldn't do it. But they're aware that they're on the wrong side of history. So they're trying to bribe folks legally to make a better image for themselves without really doing much differently. And there hasn't been much recourse. And so that's why I introduced a bill last year. It's an anti-greenwashing bill to allow for any resident of Pennsylvania to basically sue a corporation for essentially lying, deceptive practices talking about their carbon footprint, eco-friendly this or that, and so forth. And the response has been tremendous. This is the first bill of its kind on the state level. And I think given what's happening on the federal level, there's not much we can expect to happen there. So state legislatures play an active role in this and are closer to the people. I represent 66,000 people. Congress people represent around 800,000 people. But a lot of people don't know the power of state legislatures to do the work that a lot of folks demand, because we think about who resides in the Oval Office. We may know who our mayor is, but we don't know about that middle layer of state government. And state government decides probably more things that impact people's daily life than anything on the local or federal level. So I feel very proud to be on the right side of history and doing something that is long overdue. And there has been success in Canada. This has been embraced. And within really moments of this statute going into effect in Canada, some of the greenwashing websites were stripped clean.
So this was companies pulling their greenwashing claims preemptively because they knew they were going to get sued.
Right. And that's how you know it's working. If it's immediate, there's a lot of things that happen where there's no there, like there's no enforcement, there's no compliance, there's no transparency, but this was immediate. It's not worth it. So what they're going to try to do is make sure bills like mine die a quick death. And I should say that I represent 4 neighborhoods in Northwest Philadelphia. It is the largest full-time state legislature in the country. And just for transparency, in Pennsylvania, a lobbyist could buy me a summer house. And as long as I report it, that's legal. It's not legal if I don't report it. But literally, lobbyists can buy folks like me, elected officials on a state level, anything of any value. Also, wealthy donors could cut me $1 million check, $1 billion check in Pennsylvania, whereas in Congress, you have a $3,300 cap. So what does this mean? That means that the corporate influence is significant. So you need to have people who are prepared to fight the good fight and who are not infected by the corrosive influence of money in politics. And so since I don't accept lobbyist money, there are no strings for me. If you want to know who pulls my strings, call my mommy. She's one of my biggest donors, and I feel very proud of that. And I think this is important because we know that corporations are concerned about looking good, but are not really trying to do good more times than not. And legislation like this is a move in the right direction.
So for folks who are on this call who, just are interested in pursuing stuff like this or talking to their own state legislators, how did this come about? Just tell me where this came from. Where did you get the idea? Talk a little bit more about how you got to this point.
Sure. Well, it's funny. I get semi-random calls and emails from folks all over the country to look at various bills or consider different concepts that could be drafted into legislation because of previous things I've done. So because of things that I've done around climate action and environmental resilience, I was approached by the Center for Climate Integrity, and they pitched this idea to me. And I was so thrilled and honored that they reached out to me. Like, we started working on it immediately. It just made a lot of sense. And I think what I like about this too is it's replicable. So other state legislatures, and there are, I think, 3 other states that have moved since I introduced my bill, they can really copy and paste and tweak it for the respective states, do the same thing. And some states that came in after Pennsylvania will probably be able to put this into statute, because in Pennsylvania, it's a purple state, and we have a Republican-controlled Senate. So
right, so it's not going to pass in Pennsylvania.
It's not going to pass in Pennsylvania certainly not in the next 2 years, sadly. but it can pass in states like California, New York, Illinois, Connecticut, New Jersey, potentially. But again, I should say that even though that these are quote unquote blue states and blue legislatures and blue trifectas where you have a Democratic governor as well, if the money is connected to corporate corporate interests, then even in blue states, it could be a problem, like
Right.
in Pennsylvania.
So the idea basically is if a company goes out and puts out an advertisement or does a sponsorship that says, hey, we may be an oil and gas company, but we're actually great for the climate because we're reducing emissions by X amount, or because we're doing carbon capture, and it turns out to be baloney, someone can sue them and say, hey, that's greenwashing, and win a large civil liability suit against them. Am I understanding it right?
Yeah, they have to have evidence.
Yeah.
They have to have real
Yeah.
proof that what they're doing is legit. And that's a
Yeah.
very reasonable standard that most consumers appreciate, because the last thing consumers want is to be duped. Like, given how expensive goods are and how wages have not increased, while the billionaire class has gotten richer and richer, you better believe. I mean, we have a presidential election where eggs were like central in who people were going to
Yeah.
vote for, which is absurd because presidents don't decide the price of eggs. But there's a level of civic illiteracy in our country that allowed for that to be an important issue, even though that goes beyond the office of the
Yeah.
presidency.
So I want to bring this back to sports because that's in theory the topic of our conversation. And I know this is, a bill that is, greenwashing writ large. And clearly if there was a company that was, making false claims in the context of, an ad at a basketball arena, that would be connected. But I feel like, and maybe Bill or Naomi, you can help me tease this out. I feel like there's a nexus here, sort of just at the intersection of sports and culture, right? Because between politics and culture, climate and culture, because there's how do I say this? There's, Bill, you sort of made this point earlier, so maybe you can help me with this. You said something to the effect of people, know that politics matter, right, to solving climate change, but you sort of can't get politics right unless climate change is sort of understood in the right way in our culture and in our society. But that goes both ways. You can't get there's sort of this connection between climate politics and how we think about climate in our daily lives, and how we the claims that are made in advertising and marketing, like those two things are pretty intimately connected here, aren't they?
Yeah, and uh, let me just for a moment expand the
Yeah.
conversation in this direction.
Yeah, please.
It's not just that sports teams and sports in general should end this sports washing and, essentially, as Naomi says, laundering money for the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah.
It's that they should be playing an affirmative role, like everybody else in our culture, in trying to actually deal with the crisis that we're now facing. And they can. I wore on purpose this sweater tonight because it's from the World University Games, which were held the Winter Games were held in Lake Placid last year. And I was not a competitor because I'm not that good an athlete and I'm not in university anymore. But I was the honorary torchbearer because they made climate change a focus, really the focus of the games. And there were I gave lectures, lots and lots of stuff and attention focused on climate change throughout those events. I was saying earlier today about the World Nordic Skiing Championships in Norway. The great American skier Jesse Diggins is skiing today in a race suit that has a big image of melting glaciers on it, put forth by Protect Our Winters, a group of great athletes from across the planet who are doing everything they possibly can, including going to testify before Congress to try and draw attention to these things. So it's not, look, groups, people like the Dodgers are important parts of our society. And so as important parts of our society, they not only owe us the duty of not making things harder, they in a working society should be part of making things actually work. They should be going out of their way to say, we're using renewable energy to power the lights in this stadium. Because they probably are, given what you've written about Los Angeles and the fact that it's done more than any city in the country to
A
power.
lot of sports teams are. I don't know if the Dodgers are, but many teams are. And even when they say that, though, I mean, I was looking back today at a piece I wrote about the Sacramento Kings, the basketball team here in the state capital in California. I went to one of their games a couple months ago. They love to brag about how they have a solar powered arena. Their owner says it's the most sustainable arena in sports. They've got a promo at the at timeouts where they roll a Arco gas pump out onto the floor and have people pretend to pump gasoline at breaks in the game.
So you got to do both these things, and it should
Yeah.
not be too much to ask that we do both these things. This is the greatest civilizational crisis that we've ever faced. But you wouldn't know that from watching the Super Bowl or and anything else. Time for these guys to actually live up to their obligation as human beings, but also their obligation. I mean, look, in almost every city in the country, the taxpayers end up giving all these guys huge gifts all the time anyway, when they need a new stadium, when they, whatever. Some kind of responsibility comes with that. And the most basic responsibility is not drowning or, setting on fire your people who are rooting for your team.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if I could jump in there too, I think
Please.
there's an important point that Bill's raising here, because athletes are heroes, and we live in a time when we really need heroes. And there are very few like professor heroes or science heroes, but how many of us grew up with our sports heroes, right? For me, Mickey Mantle. I mean, he turned out to be a drunk, but at the time we thought he was a hero. Roger Maris, Sandy Koufax. I mean, and how many boys and girls across this country have posters of their sports heroes in their rooms, their Olympic heroes? And I worked for, yeah, we all did, right? And I worked for many years with Protect Our Winters. I'm still emeritus on their board, emerita. And I've gone with athletes to Capitol Hill. I've gone with athletes to schools and events, and to see the way people's eyes light up, and not just children, but senators and congressmen and business executives. And why is that? Why do we love sports heroes? I think it's because they do things that we can't do. But by doing things we can't do, they remind us that maybe we could do just a little bit more. And I think that's such an important metaphor for all of us in the climate space, because climate change can feel really overwhelming. It can feel kind of hopeless, and that there's like nothing I could do that would make a difference. But then you spend a few minutes with an athlete like Jesse Diggins, or I've got to spend time with the great mountaineer Conrad Anker, and you see the incredible things that these people have done, and you think, okay, well, I can dig in and I can do a little bit more myself.
Do you think I mean, I'd love to think that we can get to that aspirational point of the heroic athletes in professional sports actually, getting proactive and helping and doing positive messaging. I mean, clearly we're still at the point of like preventing the harmful and negative stuff. I guess maybe the question that I was trying to ask a couple minutes ago, thinking through the legal avenues and the type of bill that Representative Rabb is running is, I mean, is there some way, and Bill and Naomi, I know neither of you guys are lawyers, and Representative, I don't think you're lawyers anyway. And Representative Rabb, I know that sports was not necessarily on your mind when you put this bill out, but I just find myself wondering, is there some avenue to address this beyond just public pressure campaigns? I mean, I was, just because the Dodgers are the area that I've focused on the most in my reporting. There's the advertisements in the stadium, and that's a private business agreement. But then I did some additional reporting. The Dodgers Foundation, which is the charitable arm of the team, they've got sponsorship arrangements with various oil and gas companies as well, where it's sort of I forget. I'd have to look up my story to see exactly what's going on there. But basically, it's again a more explicit sports washing venue, and other teams have this stuff as well, where you're using educational STEM type stuff, health programming, stuff for women and children, stuff where the sponsors are there, promoting the idea of, hey, oil and gas is good for good for your health, etc. And maybe it's not explicit, but it's sort of all tied up in that. I guess I'm just wondering if if these are companies that are, in the case of California, for instance, getting sued for decades of deceptive practices. Is there some way to stop companies that are, if they end up getting found guilty from, I don't know if there's some history with cigarettes. I mean, didn't they have to stop advertising, or was that all just public pressure that got them to stop
Yeah,
advertising?
no, I mean, there
Yeah,
were hundreds and hundreds of lawsuits, including
yeah,
suits brought by state attorneys and ultimately by the Department of Justice, by the great hero Sharon Eubanks, the
yeah,
DOJ lawyer who really led the charge on that. And this is really important. I think I'm glad you raised this because this is something I wanted to talk about tonight.
yeah.
There's widespread misconception that we cannot address false and misleading advertisement or greenwashing because of the First Amendment. And many people seem to have the impression that the First Amendment means that anyone, any corporation, any institution can say any darn thing they please. And that is just simply false. That we have more than 250 years of history, even further if you go back in common law, in which courts have long recognized there are many areas in which speech can be limited, and particularly speech that is dishonest or misleading. So courts have carved out large areas of exceptions against fraud. Fraud is not protected by the First Amendment, and this was reiterated in the big tobacco, the DOJ, Department of Justice prosecution of the tobacco industry. Judge Gladys Kessler explicitly said the First Amendment does not protect against fraud, libel, slander, product defamation, and we're all familiar with the clear and present danger standard, the idea that you cannot say something if that something puts other people's lives at risks. And that's a standard that's been around for nearly 100 years. And particularly also, another misconception is that people forget that the First Amendment was designed to protect political speech, not commercial speech. And courts have long recognized very strong differences. And we talked about this in our prep. I'm not a First Amendment expert, but I have colleagues at Harvard who are, and I consulted with a colleague who specifically said, and I'm going to read this because it's really important. There is no First Amendment protection for commercial speech that is misleading. This is why the court, and he's referring here to the Supreme Court, has made clear that, quote, there can be no constitutional objection to the suppression of commercial messages that do not accurately inform the public about lawful activity. Now, obviously, we can go into detail and people can argue exactly about, what's misleading and how do we define misleading. But the point is clear that there is no constitutional reason why we should just fall over and die in the face of lies, deception, and misleading claims.
Representative Rabb, have you heard pushback on First Amendment grounds, or is this something that comes up when you're talking with your colleagues about your legislation?
Not of yet. If
Yeah.
After this goes back to the Judiciary Committee in the coming weeks and passes, and it looks like it's going to go to the House floor, that's when I imagine the suits will come out and make all kinds of specious arguments about First Amendment and any number of things. But I should also just mention too that when we watch these commercials about a drug, and in the very last however many seconds, this may cause bleeding of the eyes and growing of a fifth limb and all those things. That's not them being nice. They're forced to do that. They have to disclose. If we can do that for Big Pharma, which is very influential, as we all know, we should be able to do that for all of the problematic and deceptive marketing of corporations who want us to believe that they're on the right side of history. We should have that. We should have parity in that regard across the board. And lastly, and this, Sammy, I know hits close to you, we need an empowered fourth estate. We need journalists and journalistic outlets to hold these folks accountable. And maybe Bill, if you can confirm this stat that only 1% of news from corporate media outlets ever mentions climate change. Like it's that.
The statistics, I remember someone did a study of how often climate change got mentioned compared to the Kardashians on network TV in the course of a year, and it was roughly 400 to 1 or something like that. Some astonishing figure.
Oh.
The it's a very good idea. I mean, very powerful idea to imagine that every time, uh, every time Phillips 66 had to run an ad, it came with somebody at the end with a voiceover saying, use of this product may cause your community to burn to the ground like Altadena. It may cause your community to end up underwater like my town in Vermont, on and on and on. That would be useful.
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
And the language too. I just want to mention too, like um, Pennsylvania is the second largest producer of fracked gas. And I'm very clear about that term. It's fracked gas. It's not natural gas. There's nothing natural about the extraction process where you're pumping dozens and dozens of potentially carcinogenic chemicals into the ground. There's nothing natural about that. So every time environmentalists and folks who want to be on the right side of history use our adversaries' language, we lose. So we also have to make sure that the language we use makes sense and is aligned with our values and the science.
yeah. No, this was all resonating with me, and if you could see my private messages with other other reporters, both internal and external to the LA Times, you could see me strongly urging a lot of people to mention climate change a lot more frequently. I think it should be omnipresent across all coverage, including sports coverage. Frankly, should not just be a topic for environmental reporters.
Yeah, and this question of language is so important too, because we see throughout the history of these things, the way the corporate sector tries to manipulate language to make the product seem benevolent when they're not. And my favorite example of this is one that backfired on the tobacco industry. So back in the 70s and 80s, people talked about secondhand smoke, the smoke you got when the person next to you was smoking. And the tobacco industry decided they didn't like that phrase because they reckoned Americans didn't like secondhand things. So they introduced the term environmental tobacco smoke. But that backfired on them because it led the Environmental Protection Agency to say, oh, well, if this is environmental, we can regulate it. So that's a fun example where it didn't work for them, but we have lots and lots of examples where it did work for them. And we do, I think Representative Rabb is absolutely right. We have to be really mindful about the language and not let ourselves be, drawn into their framing of these issues.
Well, since we're back on tobacco, one more question. I'll open this to all of you to see what you think, and then we'll hand it over to the audience for some questions. One thing that I hear from folks who are sometimes skeptical of the fossil fuel tobacco comparison, and that I find myself wondering about too sometimes. Just when I write about the social license to operate and the need to the sort of make fossil fuel industry a social pariah and go after marketing and advertising, and it's just like it all makes sense to me, and I everything you guys are saying resonates. I mean, I've written this stuff, but is there not a difference in that with tobacco it was it's a product that a lot of people use, but it was ultimately an addictive and harmful product that it was obviously painful for a lot of folks to either give up, or if they chose to keep using it, it was harmful to them personally and maybe to people who were around them and breathing in that secondhand smoke. But I mean, with fossil fuels, for better or for worse, and obviously for worse in many ways, I mean it is the energy source that our civilization grew up around and is built upon. Is it not a whole lot? I mean, is there not something that is, quite dissonant between that comparison? Because, um, stigmatizing fossil fuels, while I do think valuable and helpful, is not going to get the job done in nearly the same way that stigmatizing tobacco is going to.
Well,
Oh,
found.
I think it's much easier with energy than with tobacco.
Oh,
I mean,
interesting. Tell me why.
well, because we now can produce the same product that the fossil fuel industry provides, power. We can produce it more cleanly and more cheaply by pointing a sheet of glass at the sun or turning a turbine in the wind. Um, um, you know, we're not. I mean, getting off tobacco is actually hard. You have to you have hours of the day when you want to stick something in your mouth, and what do you do, and so on and so forth. I mean, nobody in California really noticed last year, but California used 25% less natural gas in 2024 than it had in 2023, just because it built a lot of solar panels and stuck a lot of batteries on its grid. This is the reason why the fossil fuel industry is desperately buying politicians, greenwashing sports events. They know that they provide a product that we no longer need.
Yeah.
And the only way to keep it going is to leverage their cash to game the system.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
can jump in on that as well, just quickly. I mean, I hear that argument all the time too, but it's a very ahistorical argument because what it forgets is that if we go back to the 60s and 70s, people claimed that if we banned tobacco, the economy of the United States would collapse, and particularly that the economy of the South would collapse because tobacco was such an important economic product. Now, the reality was not only did the economy of the South not collapse, but it's actually better, more diversified today than it was in the 60s and 70s. So that argument that we can't live without this product, even though superficially it may seem like, okay, I see your point. It's really a very misleading argument.
Yeah, and we should also talk about whale fat, right? Because before the first oil well was drilled in Northeast Pennsylvania, whale fat was what we were operating with. Coal, I live in a very progressive neighborhood. I never see a sign that says ban coal, just like I never see a sign that says ban fax machines. They're obsolete, so we don't talk about it. But they were predecessors to oil and gas, and I think any argument that says, oh well, this is kind of the heart of it, uh, overlooks the fact that this was an evolving energy sources of energy that no one is asking. Maybe Trump is, but bring back coal, et cetera, et cetera. That's not a thing.
Yeah, and we could also throw in, remember, we fought a war in this country over slavery because the South insisted that the economy of the South could not manage without slaves. And there's some point at which, even if we weren't winning the economic arguments, which as Bill says we are, there's also a moral argument, which at some point you have to say, this just can't be okay if millions, hundreds of millions of people are being displaced, killed, seeing their communities destroyed, seeing their communities burnt to the ground, which Los Angeles has just witnessed, only in the last few weeks. I mean, at some point, this cannot be okay morally or economically.
Yeah, no, I appreciate all of that. I'm certainly not going to argue or necessarily disagree with any of it, except to maybe say, and I hate to, I mean, I don't want to argue with Bill of all people, but I mean, Bill, I know that we can get there. I mean, I've gotten done the reporting to get me to that point too. It's just, if we could snap our fingers and do all of the things, the technology's there, the economics are there. I think the political and land use obstacles exist, and it's
They would
yeah.
one good way to get there would be for responsible citizens
Yeah.
like sports teams to be making the point that we need to get.
Oh no, I
and it's
agree. This is why the politics and the culture are all totally intertwined. Totally.
and it would be great to hang a whole bunch of solar panels off the back of Dodger Stadium, if for no other reason than everybody coming to the game would see them as they walked in.
You heard it here first. Let's see what the audience questions are. A few of them look a bit more commenty than questiony, so I'll try to sort through them. No disrespect to anyone, but that's just what I'm seeing. Um, Recently, the British sailor Ben Ainslie was able to separate from his previous sponsors, the oil company Ineos, and is working to put together a new team for the next America's Cup competition. What advice would you give a team in a position to chart a new sustainable path like this? That is an interesting question. Any advice?
Well, if I was trying to get a sailboat racing team, find a sponsor for it, I'd go canvass the 3 or 4 biggest wind turbine manufacturers in the world. It seems like a pretty straightforward, sensible way to advertise if your product is wind.
I like that. Offshore wind, you're thinking.
Yeah,
Any wind.
it's all wind.
It is all wind. That's cool. I hadn't heard about that story. I should look into that. Let's see.
I'll note too that it's very sad that Ineos is also a big sponsor of one of the foremost bike racing teams in the world, which is particularly sad since bikes are another one of the great answers to the problem that we face.
Yeah. Um, when will the last internal combustion engine be manufactured? After that, all new vehicles will be electric. How quickly can we get there, and how do we facilitate it? Not exactly related to the topic of this discussion, but still an interesting question.
Well, it depends where you're talking, because I think the last internal combustion vehicle in China is going to be manufactured in about 2 or 3 years. Half the cars they sold this year came with plugs hanging off them. And they're now the biggest, I think, biggest car manufacturer in the world. So probably a question better asked in Changchun than in Detroit. I think we're losing I think the idea that cars come from America may be an antiquated one on our current Trumpian path.
Agreed.
Let's see. Teams are promoting and installing toxic plastic turf in communities, even when they play on natural grass. They are promoting the disconnect between the toxic and carcinogenic chemicals that are known to leach to air, water, soil, be dermally absorbed, inhaled, and ingested. We need to turn this story around, and this is difficult due to lack of access to. Okay, well, this is asking me if the LA Times can cover this. I'm not sure, but any thoughts on that topic of natural grass versus plastic turf in sports?
Well, I know as a former soccer dad, I would see when I take my son to the suburbs and play on AstroTurf, these puffs come up, and I believe they're recycled tires, oftentimes. It can't be good, and so even when there's innovation to prevent maybe injuries or provide for uniformity for a field, there are other costs associated with it. So even if it's cheaper to maintain, it can also cause great harm because of the substances, the chemicals involved in making that, and the long-term damage to the environment and to the players. So that's a real concern. And I think we as Americans are often very short-sighted. And I think, frankly, a lot of it has to do with Wall Street and how success is looked at in terms of quarters and not in terms of generations. And I think that's infected the entire society and certainly our economy. Before World War II, the percentage of our economy that was based in finance, where it was not really providing products or services, was very small and is increasingly large since then. And I just want to mention one other thing related to Wall Street. We're talking about publicly traded corporations. That is a privilege that is conferred to corporations through the Securities and Exchange Commission. In terms of media outlets, journalistic and otherwise, there is a spectrum that the government controls, and that's the FCC. So in a very real sense, if we wanted to connect the dots, we could say any publicly traded corporation, any media outlet that uses the airwaves, which is, all of them, that they are responsible for sharing information around this existential threat of the climate crisis. That's possible. It seems radical, and it is, but it also is certainly doable. And we have had successes 50 years ago that people embraced, and now there's a level of amnesia where we don't even realize what we did. And I'll give you a perfect example. In Pennsylvania, we're one of only 2 states that have what's called a green amendment. So in our Constitution, we amended it in 1971 to explicitly embrace environmental stewardship. It was passed unanimously in a bicameral bipartisan way in 1971. So this is pre-woke. This is pre all of this stuff. This was done in 1971. So we are actually regressing. Some of our best achievements have already happened. We need to go back and learn from our victories and take it up a notch.
Yeah, and also
Yeah.
if I could just add to that an important point. It's really important to remember that the fossil fuel industry is also the petrochemical industry. And we know that the fossil fuel industry has actively promoted the use of plastics, actively promoted things like astroturf, both metaphorically and literally, and that they were extremely active just this past year in helping to derail an international treaty that would have taken a big step forward in preventing plastic pollution in the oceans. So the plastic question, the synthetic turf and fossil fuels are all intimately related. And this is one of the reasons why, as we started this conversation, sports, turf, petrochemicals, fossil fuels, these are all related issues. So I think the commentator was right to raise that. I'm glad that they did.
So we've got a few more questions here coming in and only a couple minutes left. So let's try to get through these. And by the way, I just wanted to quickly flag with regards to the FCC, interesting thought about mandating climate coverage. Not sure I'm a fan the way the FCC is going these days of using it as a tool to mandate certain types of coverage, but intriguing thought. Are you aware of any studies that demonstrate the impact of climate change on various sports? Anything come to mind for anybody?
Yeah, there's a lot of data emerging on, I know the data best on endurance sports that I pay attention to, but on degradation of performance in heat, and on the danger that comes for average people participating in endurance sports in the heat. The things that we do on this planet, we learned how to do in a different climate than the one that we inhabit now. And you just can't do that's why the Olympic marathon is, often now run at night, because you can't do the things that we used to be able to do in the world that the fossil fuel industry has built for us.
And also school kids, particularly high school football. There's a number of studies that have shown that increasingly the conditions in American high schools, particularly in hot places like Texas or Arizona, are making it dangerous for high school students to play football.
Good question for me here. Are the Dodgers players themselves active in sustainable causes in private life, and do they get recognized for that? Frankly, I've expended a little energy trying to answer that question myself and have not had any luck in finding out if any of the Dodgers players are very environmentally active. So it's a good question, and I don't have a good answer for it. If I have any luck with that one, you will see me report it. Another good question here. LA is about to host the World Cup where IFA has FIFA, I assume that means yes, there's a correction, where FIFA has ties to Saudi Arabia, followed by the Olympics. Any thoughts on how the Los Angeles City Council and Mayor, which will have some say over the games and venues, could be approaching this issue? Good question. Good coverage area for me, but you guys all have any thoughts on that?
Well, FIFA became a kind of byword for corruption in sports. And the most remarkable example being their decision to award the World Cup to Qatar, where it was too hot to play games until they figured out how to air condition outdoor stadiums. Look, these are. I think there's going to be considerable dissent in LA about hosting the Olympics anyway, given the cost of rebuilding from the fires. And it would be actually a perfect opportunity to try and make those games into a real focus on climate change, a real way to try and raise awareness in every possible way. And in the process, pay tribute to the people who lost their lives and their homes in those blazes. And I would just add to that, to go back to the Dodgers for a minute, that because the Dodgers are arguably one of the 3 or 4 most international franchises of any sport on earth, alongside, I don't know what, Manchester City and a couple other soccer teams and things. The Dodgers reach across the Pacific to Asia, which they've exploited for extraordinary commercial advantage, is another reason why they have if they're going to be a global team, they should have something to say about global warming. That should be a bottom line.
There, that's a good note to end on. And I know we're past 6 years, so I think we should probably call it there. Thank you guys so much for doing this panel. Zan, Morgan, thank you for organizing it, for asking me to be involved. Yeah, this has been a good discussion. And to those who are asking, yes, there will be a recording, I believe Zan sent around to everyone who signed up.
We will do that.
Thank
Hi,
you
everybody.
all. Have
Thanks,
fun, everybody.
everyone. Thanks all.
Good night.